Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that shines the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith, and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org. I also want to remind you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues. Our goal at PJTN is to equip you to stand against the disinformation by taking back local control of your community and your children's and grandchildren's education. The first step to that process is education. We must become informed. Remember to visit our website daily to receive updates on all of PJTN's groundbreaking initiatives and programs, and sign up to receive PJTN's media and action alerts to share with family and friends. As a PJTN watchman, your action could mean all the difference in the success of our global mission to combat the enemy that is trying to rob our children of their future. So please, help me spread this vital information today. Having said that, we are commanded in the Bible to teach our children the Word of God as stated in Joel chapter 1, verse 3. Tell your children about it, let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. That's 3 generations of children who are to be taught about God's covenant with Israel and the exodus from Egypt. Unfortunately, we have failed miserably, and we are witnessing the evidence of that in our classrooms today. So what can we do to take back local control of our community? What are some actions that must be taken to reverse the course we are currently on? We are witnessing parents and citizens nationwide who are mobilizing against the propaganda and history revisionism being peddled to our children, and now we are even witnessing anti-Semitism and Holocaust revisionism in their curriculum as well. Organizations and institutions that were once considered respected and trusted have bought into the anti-American, anti-Judeo-Christian narrative and can no longer be trusted. More and more teaching organizations like the National Education Association, as well as teachers' unions, and the National School Board Association have bought into this propaganda and are actively pushing this effort that will ultimately destroy our republic unless we engage. On last week's podcast, we discussed the National School Board Association's letter to the Biden administration to designate parents and citizens who attend school board meetings to hold their local school board members accountable for the policies and curriculum they are peddling to our children. In response, Attorney General Merrick Garland essentially issued a declaration of war in a memo to weaponize the FBI, including the criminal division of U.S. attorneys in 14,000 school districts across the U.S., addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, stating that in the next 30 days, the department will announce a series of measures designed to address the rise of supposed criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. Who is the target of that investigation? Parents and grandparents, moms and dads. It's not Antifa, who murdered people in the streets, destroyed public and private property. No, it's law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. We are the target of our Attorney General. This is outrageous. And as if that were not enough, we were told that the Palm Beach County school principal, who was fired for suggesting that the Holocaust didn't happen the way history has recorded it, was reinstated with back pay. Additionally, another education administrator in a Dallas-Fort Worth school district ordered teachers to provide books that taught an opposing perspective of the Holocaust narrative. On this week's podcast, I have invited Dr. David Patterson back to Proclaiming Justice to discuss this disturbing trend. Dr. Patterson holds the Hillel A. Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, University of Texas at Dallas, and is a senior research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He is a commissioner on the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission and a member of the executive board of the annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and the Churches. He has lectured at universities on 6 continents and throughout the United States. A winner of the National Jewish Book Award, the Korek Jewish Book Award, and the Holocaust Scholars Conference Eternal Flame Award. He has published 40 books and more than 240 articles, essays, and book chapters on topics in literature, philosophy, the Holocaust, and Jewish studies. His most recent books are Judaism, Anti-Semitism, Holocaust, Reflections on Connections, Shoah and Torah, Portraits, Elie Wiesel's Hasidic Legacy, the Holocaust and the Non-Representable, and Anti-Semitism and its Metaphysical Origins. Dr. Patterson, welcome back to Proclaiming Justice.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation and for your good work.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand this growing trend and threat to the memory of the Holocaust. You know, earlier this year, we were honored to have your participation in drafting Holocaust standards for Governor DeSantis' Department of Education. And it was my first encounter with Holocaust educators who wanted to universalize the Holocaust in drafting K through 12 Holocaust standards. I also testified before the Palm Beach County School Board asking the members to fire William Latson, you remember, the principal of Spanish River High School, for telling a parent that he couldn't respond to her inquiry about what was being taught to students about the Holocaust. And of course, when they reinstated him, they gave him his back pay of $150,000. And more recently, which is why I asked you to join me on the show today, was last week, the administrator, Gina Petty, an administrator in Southlake, Texas, told her teachers that if they had books on the Holocaust in their classrooms, they need to make sure they have books with opposing viewpoints. So my question, Dr. Patterson, what is happening? Are these incidents related? Is this a trend?
Yes, of course they're related. And you also mentioned earlier the concern at the federal level over parents questioning things like the critical race theory curriculum and the connection. Gina Petty's remarks came in the context of a law that was recently passed in Texas, indicating that when theoretical positions are presented, there should be alternative positions. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The intention, I'm sure, was critical race theory. In other words, critical race theory should not be taught as an absolute truth, but as one of a possible, a range of ways of understanding how society works.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a theory, but the Holocaust is not a theory. It's not a theory. And in looking for an example to present to her teachers on, what sort of topic would call for an opposing view, Gina Petty chose the Holocaust as her example, her case in point. Okay, but this of course is a form of Holocaust denial.
Mm-hmm.
And Holocaust denial is always driven by anti-Semitism.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not about examining evidence of whether the Holocaust happens as has happened.
Mhm.
It's not about history. It's about fleeing from the profound ways in which the systematic extermination of the Jews implicates us in how we understand the holiness of the other human being,
Right.
how we are called out, like Adam was asked, "Where are you?
Mhm.
Cain? Where's your brother? What have you done?" Um, this de-Judaizing the Holocaust is a way to slip into hiding the way Adam hid.
Mhm.
Asked, "Where are you?"
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because as I had just mentioned, we saw the influence of that even among Holocaust educators when they were wanting to universalize the standards that we were working on drafting for Florida students for the Department of Education. And that was really an eye opener for me because I thought, these people that are going to be reviewing the standards that we are drafting and um, giving the approval as to whether they would accept them to see the comments that they made and how they wanted to um, universalize this issue and take away the reality of Hitler and his final solution to the Jewish question. It's more about trying to make everybody feel good about each other instead of focusing on Holocaust education and Holocaust history. It's, if they want to mention, genocides, all the genocides that have taken place and make the Holocaust part of a genocide that happened, I can understand that. But when we're talking about drafting Holocaust standards, and this is going to be something that PJTN is going to be working on in the states across this country, basically taking the standards that were adopted in Florida and introducing them in other states where we are working. So, it's just it's disturbing that we had that kind of pushback from people who should know better. But I feel like maybe we are witnessing a trend. What do you think?
Oh, yes, yes, and the trend shows itself in a number of ways. Uh, the For example, you mentioned the fear of offending people, hurting feelings, keeping safe spaces. There's no safe space when you
Hmm.
engage the Holocaust. There is no safe space. It's a space of horror.
Hmm.
It's a space that opens up to us the most fundamental question of what we mean, what we stand for, what we won't stand for. The Jewish, what I call the Jewish question, is precisely what I mentioned earlier. It's, where's your brother? What have you done? And none of us can quite live up to that question. That's
Hmm.
so unsettling. I mean, the Jews have an unsettling presence. The Holocaust announces our infinite responsibility to and for the other human being.
Hmm.
It has unfolded over the centuries through the tradition and teachings of Judaism and
Hmm.
you know traditions that stem from Judaism, and that the Jewish people represent by their very presence in the world. So, if I can put the Jews into a category of victims in general, and not this singular category of the question that haunts me and troubles my own sleep, that
Hmm.
that won't allow me to sleep through the outcry surrounding me, uh, then I can de-Judaize it. I can make it safe. I can have a good cry and feel much better.
Hmm.
Um, but like I said, there's no safe space, and anyone who engages it has to be traumatized and offended. You know,
Hmm.
Baby said that when the Russians arrived at Auschwitz, the look on their face was not just outrage or anger. It was a look of shame.
Mm,
And believe me, it takes a lot to shame the soldiers of the Red Army.
mhm.
They were ashamed at what human beings have done and what it tells us about our humanity. Uh, so we look for ways, like it's the Adam syndrome,
Mhm.
hiding, because we are afraid
Right.
to stand it. It takes courage to engage this subject matter.
It's a great analogy that you use. Where's your brother? And that you're absolutely right. We cannot, as humanity, cannot live up to that question. Because, of course, the response from Cain was, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It was a very nonchalant, just blowing it off. And how true that is about the Holocaust, because look at the many opportunities that were given to many nations to absorb the Jews, to help them get out of Europe so that they wouldn't be slaughtered. And we, even the United States of America, we had the opportunity with the St. Louis. And after port after port after port, they were turned away. And many of those who did return to Europe on the St. Louis ended up perishing in the Holocaust because we would not respond at the time, which is really, it causes us to really question the heart of our government and the intentions of our government. If our government is not for humanity, to defend humanity and to defend these innocent people, just like what's happening in Afghanistan right now. This is a modern day example of, how our government just turned its back on its own citizens and on people who had helped us while we were there for 20 years. So it really is, we need to, as human beings, we need to look in the mirror. We need to ask ourselves, are we going to allow this to happen? I mean, look at what's happening to our country. And as if the battle we are facing in classrooms across this nation for the minds of our children, that wasn't bad enough. Are we willing to speak up on behalf of our children, for our kids, for their future? Because with this onslaught of critical race theory, we're seeing that the polls are beginning to confirm that we are losing the battle. We have to re-educate Americans, especially our American children, about the truth regarding Holocaust history. And I was reading earlier in preparation for this interview that there are 17 states that mandate some sort of Holocaust education. And, I wonder, it's only 17 out of 50 states. Is that enough to combat the rise of anti-Semitism? And especially when we're competing against educators who are sanctioning it. What are your thoughts?
Well, anti-Semitism is taking on more and more acceptable and fashionable forms. We have emerging in our world, in our society, what I call morally required anti-Semitism. It generally takes the form of anti-Zionism,
Hmm.
which entails, demonizing not just the Jews but the Jewish state,
Hmm.
making no distinction between Jews and Zionists, um, laying out different categories of understanding the forces at work. And by that I mean, I have in mind critical race theory.
Hmm.
This movement, which actually goes back to the 70s in the law schools, and 80s too. I mean, it has a history, a theoretical history,
Hmm.
but the theoretical has become political. Um, and it's connected to movements like Black Lives Matter, Nation of Islam,
Hmm.
um, and other movements in which race becomes the defining term for who and what we are as human beings.
Right.
once race is the basis of the value of a human being, once race is understood in terms of political and social dynamics and power, then you have a way of thinking that is inherently anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be anti-Semitic. According to Jewish teaching and other traditions that followed, and this is something articulated by a great Jewish philosopher named Emil Fackenheim. He says that regarding Jewish teaching concerning the human being, it says, never was a more exalted view of man conceived than that of the divine image,
Mm.
and never one more radically anti-racist. It was therefore grimly logical, he says, that the most radical racists of all time decreed a unique fate for the Jewish people.
Mm.
Critical race theory and this Jewish teaching about divine image cannot live in the same universe. This Jewish tradition undermines race as a basis for human value.
Mm.
In fact, the Hebrew word for human being is ben Adam, which means a child of Adam.
Mm.
We come from one human being and not two, say our sages, so that no one can say to another, my side of the family is better than your side of the family.
Mm.
Right. So critical race theory posits many sides, and not of a family, but of privileged and underprivileged classes in competition. And so race functions in critical race theory much as economic class functions for Marxism. And of course, it's influenced by Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
It tells us that race separates us as human beings by unbridgeable gaps.
Mm-hmm.
The category of white, the color white, is not about color of skin, it's about class privilege.
Right.
Therefore, the critical race theorists will say all Jews are white.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been to Israel, Laurie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you walk a block in Jerusalem, you'll see Jews of every color, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every description. And you'll hear a dozen or more different languages along the way. But of course, the term white in this critical race theory is a synonym for evil.
Right.
White privilege is the source of all evil. And as I said, this way of thinking, in order to be consistent with itself, has to be anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw the evidence of that in California with the signing of the Governor Newsom of the ethnic studies model curriculum. It now will be required to teach this form of critical race theory to students in California. You can't graduate without learning this. And one of the things that, of course, our organization took issue with was the fact that it was anti-Semitic. And so to appease those of us who were, accusing them of peddling this anti-Semitic propaganda, they decided to make Jews of color, just like what you mentioned, because it is true. You walk through any city, Jerusalem and any city throughout the nation of Israel, and you will find people of different backgrounds. And of course, here with the ethnic studies model curriculum, they decided to separate Jews of color that were maybe, Arab or maybe Sephardic or Moroccan who had darker skin, then they would be considered minorities. But the Jews who were white, Ashkenazi from Europe, no, they were part of the white privilege class. And they thought that they could get away with it. Unfortunately, they did. They had a governor who agreed with them, and now California parents are being forced to have this taught to their children in their public schools, unless the parents decide it's time to pull their kids out of the system. But no, you hit the nail.
Well, so you can see the connection with issues in Holocaust education,
Mm-hmm.
by removing Jews or de-Judaizing it, as we've talked about many times.
Mhm. Right.
Um, and this is a problem that's been in the making for some time. I have, in part of my background, I've reviewed textbooks for use in high school,
Hmm.
and some of those books describe the Holocaust as the time when Hitler sent undesirables to the camps, or
Hmm.
Hitler sent anyone he regarded as inferior to the camps and killed them. Hitler sent Russians, Poles, Gypsies, Jews, and other people to the camps without making any distinction in the nature of the victims, which is an insult to all of the victims. It's
Hmm.
to the Poles, to the Russians, to the Gypsies as well, right? Not just the Jews.
Yep.
And most fundamentally, and I think this is most critical in understanding the dynamics of anti-Semitism, is who are the Jews?
Right.
What are the anti-Semites anti anyway? What would the anti-Semite remove from the world? Exactly. What is it?
Hmm.
What are the Nazis trying to exterminate? And I think, ultimately, it's the Jewish question: where is your brother, and what? Because
Hmm.
my brother, my fellow human being, my sister, is created in the divine image. He or she has an infinite value, which makes my responsibility infinite.
Right.
I am never enough. I can never be enough, love enough, say, here I am for you enough. I can never respond enough, because each time I respond, I become even more responsible.
Right.
Uh, and like I said, just by the Jews' presence, the Jewish people's presence in the world signifies that millennial teaching and tradition that we, and I'm Jews too,
Hmm.
from.
Hmm. Yep.
But without it, our lives are truly meaningless.
Hmm.
Without being asked and called to a reckoning, where is your fellow human being? Where are you?
Hmm.
What have you done? Without having to face that question, we are turned over to emptiness and
Right.
meaninglessness. And the true horror that we face in human life, that we have to wrestle with, it's not suffering or evil exactly. It's meaningless suffering, meaningless evil. It's
Right.
meaninglessness.
That's a good point. Because it is meaningless. And, we were raised with the golden rule. Of course, we know that that comes from the Torah, it comes from the scriptures, to treat others as we would want to be treated. And so when we look at humanity and we look at singling out a people group, especially the Jewish people, because this is not, the Holocaust didn't happen in a vacuum. This has been going on for, as long as the Jewish people have been in existence. We go all the way back to, the persecution of the Jews in Egypt, and we saw the persecution of the Jews in Persia. We saw the pogroms throughout Europe. We saw the Inquisition. And of course, our modern day is the Holocaust. And ironically, we barely even touch on these historic events. And of course, that was one of the things that PJTN's goal was with the standards in Florida with regards to civic standards and with the Holocaust standards. Earlier this year, and you're probably familiar with the Boston Globe article by Jeff Jacoby, where he cited a survey by the Claims Conference that stated, despite all this education that's going on, what the survey, and I'm referring back to the 17 states that have mandated Holocaust studies. So, what the survey revealed was a worrying lack of basic Holocaust knowledge. He cited in that survey that 63% of millennials and Gen Zers did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany. And when asked if they could name any of the more than 40,000 concentration camps, ghettos, or extermination sites into which Jews were forced, 48% were unable to identify even one. And more than 1 in 5, 22%, could not be sure that they have definitely heard about the Holocaust. Now, you're a professor at UT in Dallas. Do you see these same percentages in the students that come through your class?
Well, maybe when they come into my class, but not when they go out of my class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yes, well, it's there's a lack of interest in history in general. History is perhaps the most important subject that we should study because we
Mm-hmm.
can't make sense of anything now if we don't know history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this includes the Holocaust, as you pointed out. But and the Holocaust doesn't come out of nowhere, and it comes not only from a history of anti-Semitism, but from uh, history of Western civilization
Mm-hmm.
and Middle Eastern civilizations, not just Western. History of Christendom, history of Islam. It's a complicated history. It's a lot of work to learn. Requires engagement. It's not always pleasant learning. It's traumatizing, um, but it's it, it is a form of Holocaust denial. It's history in general, but I would say Holocaust in particular. I've encountered this among other professors, not where I am now at UT Dallas, but in other places I've been. Uh, there's a resistance to teaching anything about the Holocaust on the college level.
Interesting.
I've
Why
had,
is that?
well, for the reasons that we've suggested, they're safe space,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I've had other professors say to me, are you're teaching a course on the Holocaust again? Can't we get over it?
Mm.
People are
Wow.
tired of it. It happens.
Wow.
No one says you're teaching a course on the Civil War again.
Mm.
No. So there's that form of denial. There's this flight from it, which is part of the de-Judaizing. To flee from the Holocaust is to flee from the Jew. And I would say to the Christian listeners, it's a flight from the Jew who lies at the foundation of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
the one on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm.
it's it's there's a big part of the history of anti-Semitism entails de-Judaizing of
Right.
itself. De-Judaizing
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, Spanish Inquisition,
Mm-hmm.
infamous example.
Mm-hmm.
You get the forms of de-Judaizing scriptures in Islam, where the Quran says that the Jews are falsifiers of the divine word.
Mm.
Um, and in the modern period, as part of modern thinking, I would say from Descartes on. Descartes died in 1650. He's known as the father of modern philosophy. As the ego becomes more and more the center, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." Not
Yes.
created me or God commands me, or no, it's I think, therefore I am. Uh, you have a process of thinking God out of the picture,
Right.
and that always entails thinking the Jews out of the picture, and with
Mm-hmm.
Jews, anyone else who embraces a revealed religion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jew hatred is God hatred.
Right.
Jew hatred is human hatred. Jew hatred is hatred of the other human being, not just the Jew, because it's the Jew who announces to us the infinite dearness of the other human being, of the other
Right.
Adam, the child of Adam. Um, and I think part of it is, if I can add just a couple more words, the commandment in the Torah that is most frequently repeated is the commandment concerning our love and care for the stranger,
Mm-hmm.
right? The one who's not part of our crowd,
Right.
the one who is strange, the one who is not a believer, not in my political party,
Mm-hmm.
looks weird, looks different. Um, and I think it's the most frequently repeated because it's perhaps the most counterintuitive. Um, I'm okay with loving my neighbor, my buddy. I hang
Mm-hmm.
with him. He's a great guy. But the stranger, the one that looks not like me, doesn't think like me, I have to attend to his hunger and his thirst and his suffering as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm.
uh,
Very
and
good
most of us,
points.
yeah. Anyway, most of us don't want to say,
Mhm.
be required to do that.
Yeah, that's why hospitality is an important component of Judaism. And we learned about that last week in the Torah portion about greeting strangers who come upon us and showing hospitality. Um, it's true. The Jews are the ones that remind us of of God. And we live in a time when the culture, and it seems to be globally, when people are the last thing on their mind is God and faith and, you know, um, being held to a biblical standard. And even people of faith who are engaged in their faith to some degree, just like what you said, people don't want to be interrupted in their space. They want to be left alone. We become focused on ourselves and not on each other. And of course, when we turn our back on the Jews, really, it's an example of turning our back on humanity itself. So there was an interesting prophetic, and I don't know if General Eisenhower would have considered himself a prophet. But it was interesting. He said when he came upon a concentration camp, when they liberated a concentration camp in Europe, he said he told all of those who were with them, get it all on record now, get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened. And here we are today. We've got two examples, and I'm sure there's plenty more. With William Latson and Gina Petty as current examples of this. Trying to water down what happened and saying that there are differing opinions about what happened during the Holocaust, and of course with Jeff Jacoby's article and seeing the percentage of young people and even adults who don't know this information. It was such a very prophetic statement. It always boggles my mind that here he saw one of the greatest tragedies to humanity, and that was his statement. That somebody will come along one day and say that it didn't happen. So why are we witnessing this trend? Why now, Dr. Patterson? What is it about society, about our culture, that we're witnessing this movement, even among educators, to acknowledge the truth of the Holocaust. I mean, we have films, we have the Nuremberg trials, we have the testimonies, we have the eyewitnesses, and of course, many of them are dying off. But why? We haven't even gotten, not all of those, all of the survivors have passed on, and we're already saying, we're making a different conclusion than what was actually documented historically.
Yes. Well, part of the most essential part of the history is not just what happened, but why it matters. In other words, there's a depth dimension of the history that comes out in things like personal testimonies, the assault on the soul, the assault on God, the assault on human relationship. And Elie Wiesel's Night captures a lot of this. I think it's widely, I won't say misunderstood, but not understood enough. His famous memoir, Night, which was originally titled "And the World Remains Silent," as you touched on earlier, the silence of the world. But at the end of Night, he gazes into a mirror and a corpse gazes back at him. It's the corpse of his soul. He has undergone a radical assault on his soul. He has endured the anti-world, the horror of a realm in which, as he was told, there are no fathers, there are no sons, there are no friends, there are no brothers, there is no human relationship. That's how you kill the soul. You kill the relationship. As we slip farther and farther away from human relationship, as we become more incapable of saying to our fellow human, "Here I am for you," our souls languish. Our souls begin to suffocate. When we look at the Holocaust as a civilization, it's a mirror that we gaze into, and a corpse looks back at us. Also, when we look into it as not just civilization, but as an individual, um, it's the cost requires gazing into a mirror. Peering into that glass darkly, as it's written. Um, and it's like Dorian Gray, if you know the story, the portrait of Dorian Gray, gazing upon his own horrific portrait. And because we don't know about it, we haven't explored it, we haven't studied it, we're not equipped to respond to the horror. We know there's something wrong, but we don't know where to turn. We know the bulwarks around us are cracking, but where do we turn? We're more and more incapable of saying what sanctifies life. Why does relation matter? What does human relation consist of? Because we're so entrenched in our egos, our counterfeit self. As Abraham Joshua Heschel once said, the self is a self-deception. In the commandment, probably one of the most familiar commandments, love your neighbor as yourself. If we look at the Hebrew, and I won't repeat the Hebrew, but the Hebrew means the as yourself means that is who you are. In other words, whoever you are as a human being lies in the midst of that loving relationship. And it's a relationship not of feeling, but of giving, of treating, of acting in a loving manner toward the other. If it's about feeling, it sends us back into the ego, right?
Right.
It's not about feeling good about myself. It bothers me when I say be nice to somebody because it'll make you feel good. Be nice to somebody even if it doesn't make you feel good because it's not about you.
Right.
Be nice to somebody, especially if you don't feel like it. That's why we're commanded. If we felt like it, we wouldn't need the commandment. So um, the age of me, is an age of deception. It's an age of anti-Semitism. It's an age of bigotry in general.
Hmm.
It's an age of God hatred, human hatred. Um, because to break free of it requires coming out of hiding. It requires saying "Hineni, here I am for you," as especially when that is scary
Hmm.
and takes us out of our safe space.
Right. Very good points. With the increase in educators who are buying into this propaganda and adopting the pedagogical policy that will subtly increase anti-Semitism in future generations, what can we do? What can legislators do? What can educators do? And parents to reverse the course we're headed, because we are talking about training up the next generation. And yes, it all starts in the home with parents raising their children and teaching them these values like what you've discussed. But then our children are confronted with these educators and legislators who legislate this. Now, fortunately, in Texas, for this situation with Gina Petty, the state legislator, came out. Their intentions when they passed that legislation was to counter the disinformation with critical race theory. But, here you have somebody who arrogantly, you know, chimes in and says, "Well, because they passed this law, this is what we're going to have to do now." I mean, it was totally out of control, and it was totally unacceptable, a totally unacceptable statement to make. But what can we do? Because these are, I remember a decade ago when a parent came to me with a textbook being used in our school district, and it had an anti Semitic quote in it. And it also delegitimized the state of Israel. And the teacher, when we went to the teacher and the principal of the school that was using the textbook, because the child came home, this is a ninth grade kid who was homeschooled through eighth grade. His mother decided to put him in the public school system because he would have more opportunities to, do extracurricular activity and get out and, socialize with kids in the broader community. And this kid came home questioning his faith. I mean, after 2 months of being in the public school system, and this, again, is a kid who was solidly homeschooled. And he questioned the Bible, the authenticity of it, just because one teacher, one day in the class, handing out information and reviewing a chapter in a textbook. I mean, how do you compete against this? Because in public schools, for parents who do have their children in the public school system and homeschooling isn't an option for them, they have no choice. I mean, they would have to, of course, I'm telling parents, you need to, when your child comes home from school every day and you're sitting at the dinner table having dinner, it's a great opportunity to have a conversation. What did you learn today? Did anything stand out that you thought was interesting or that you didn't know or you hadn't heard before? But, you know, what do you do, Dr. Patterson? This is
Perhaps even greater than the challenge to educate our children is the challenge to educate the parents.
Mhm.
Um, Education, it takes a lot of work, learning, and you're never done. You're
Right.
never done.
Is it true?
Uh, Number one. Number two, what what is the alternative way of thinking? The alternative, what is presented very often and very broadly in the public schools. Uh, the alternative way of thinking and understanding lies in our religious traditions.
Hmm.
I think when I say educate the parents, it's not only you know the parents have to be aware themselves of history. They have to know how to respond to misinformation that their kids come home with. But if the parents are not educated in a revealed religious tradition,
Mm-hmm.
they're not in a position to respond. They don't know
Mm-hmm.
what other way is there of thinking.
Right.
So um, the it's not just the content of the thinking; it's the way that we think, the categories that shape the thinking, the mode of thinking. For example, um, basic. Well, to revealed religion is revelation. I just mentioned revelation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Revelate to think in terms of revelation requires not just changing what we think, but how we think.
Mm-hmm.
As to render God superfluous is to render revelation superfluous. So the next thing you know, we have the premise
Mm-hmm.
that holy scriptures, whatever your holy scriptures might be, your holy scriptures are something that some dreamed up, some time ago. It's not from God. It's from the culture. It's from the ethnicity. It's from the region. Uh, Therefore, you can take it or leave it.
Right.
Right. It's like Homer, the Odyssey, or something.
Mm-hmm.
So if a solid education in our religious traditions is essential to being able to respond to the assault on the sacred that we see happening around us all the time.
Right.
Um, and I would say it's not even a question of necessarily belief, or speaking as a Jew, it's more a question of study and learning than of believing. I mean, the believing comes with the learning, the believing
Mm-hmm.
with the doing. As the Israelites said, we will do it and we will hear it.
Right. That's a good point. You have to, in order to obey, you first have to do. That's part of the action. You have to do by faith what we know to be true from studying the texts of the scriptures. And that is what gives us the foundation to, the positions that we take. It's why I do what I do. It's why you do what you do, because your faith is very important to you. And that is the foundation to which everything else lies, at least in our lives. And I think that's true of many, no matter where people are on the planet, especially in Western countries. You know, we need to get back to grounding ourselves back in our faith because
And our deeds. God,
that's right.
God asked Cain, "What have you done?" Right.
Hmm.
The deed engenders the faith, and the faith engenders the deed. It's not either. It's not either or. It's not even which comes first. I would say. Although, again, I think you know performing the act of loving kindness, even if you don't see the point, is essential. I mean, doing it, to my mind, is most essential. But I wouldn't say insist. Oh, you got to do first. Um, but I remember I was director of an honors college at a university, and I introduced a community service requirement for students who wanted to graduate with honors. And it wasn't, a huge number of hours, but almost invariably, once they started doing it, they
Hmm.
went way beyond the requirement.
Mm.
Because once they started doing it, they saw what was at stake.
Mm.
They saw the importance of what was doing. All they needed was a little nudge,
Hmm.
you know? And it's like you in your own work. the more you do, the more the greater your sense of urgency, right?
Right. That's correct.
The broader your field of vision increases with every action.
Yes. It's so true. My board is asking me, okay, how much of this are we going to be able to accomplish? I don't know. But you know what? I don't see anybody else out there doing this. So we're going to have to. We're the answer. Oh, God will come along and provide the resources that we need for sure. Oh, Dr. Patterson, I so appreciate your taking the time. It's always just a pleasure to be with you, to hear your thoughts, and to help ground us again, even in the midst of the chaos and the challenges that we are facing, bringing us back to reality. And I would like to ask you one last question for our audience. How can people follow your work?
Um, well, they can search my name, David Patterson, on the University of Texas at Dallas website.
Mm-hmm.
It's utdallas.edu.
Okay.
Um, my books are on Amazon. Uh, there's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism has me in many places. It's ISGAP,
Right.
ISGAP.org. So those are some places where my work is tracked regularly. My webinar appearances, other appearances.
Well, we definitely want to connect PJTN with you and the work that you are doing and make it accessible to our audience as well. And again, I want to thank you for taking time out on this Sunday afternoon to have this conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the facts. And as PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to warn our family, friends, and our neighbors about this existential threat to our Jewish communities and to our communities, as we've just heard Dr. Patterson so eloquently state. That this is a threat to all of us. It's a threat to humanity when we're not going to stand with our brother. How will God judge us? Because that's the other question we have to ask ourselves. If we stand by as the world, even Christian leaders, accept the disinformation of Holocaust education and indoctrination of our children in our local classrooms against these historic truths, we cannot remain silent. You know, God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman, that when the watchman sees the enemy advancing, it is the watchman who is supposed to warn the inhabitants of the city so that the inhabitants can prepare. But if the watchman fails to warn the inhabitants and any of them, their blood is shed, it's going to be required of that watchman. You know, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer also reminded us, I love this quote, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. In closing, don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about taking back local control of our community and our children's education. I also want to remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this effort for just $20 a month. PJTN is on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful financial support and, of course, most importantly, your prayers. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. And I want to leave you with a scripture just to encourage you out of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. And it says, this is God speaking to Moses, when you go out to battle against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and a people more numerous than you, be not afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be when you have come near the battle, that the priest will approach and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you approach this day to battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts faint. Fear not, and do not tremble, nor be you terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Ladies and gentlemen, God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.